My guest today is Jesse Murray of Sagetti. How are you, Jesse?
Good. Good to be here.
How long have you been doing SharePoint development?
November 2005, the original alpha.
Wow. I know you have some strong opinions about the right way to do SharePoint development.
Sure.
Tell me about that.
SharePoint development is not as straightforward as ASP.NET development.
Yes.
It is a framework unto itself. So while it is as much a product and tool that everybody uses for collaboration and whatnot, it is a development framework. Problem is, most people don't understand how to use the development framework. It has a fully documented API, mostly documented API, but most people tend toward web parts. It's the simplest way to do development in SharePoint is, I'd like to write a web part.
Are web parts bad?
No, not necessarily. If you have a function that you need that would be communicating web part to web part, just like ASP.NET does, that's fine. When you resort to writing entire applications inside of web parts and then dropping it on SharePoint, it's really no different. You're really not using SharePoint.
Okay.
SharePoint has a number of things that you ought to use architecturally, and this is ways that you can extend SharePoint that end users will accept. When you write a web part, you're very clearly not SharePoint anymore. You're writing a web part.
Okay. And just to be clear, a web part is it's basically an ASP.NET page.
It's an ASP.NET
that is hosted inside of SharePoint.
Yes, it is the actual ASP.NET web parts. The previous version, there were SharePoint web parts, but it's just ASP.NET 2.0.
Okay.
The web part communication, same way. But the applications themselves, they don't tend to feel like you're in SharePoint anymore. And that's kind of where I say the right way of doing things in SharePoint. I'd like to see folks extending SharePoint at the points provided. There are places in SharePoint that are naturally extension points.
For example?
Content types are a great one. Vast majority of people don't ever look at content types as a way of maintaining an information architecture.
What would define content type?
Formalized XML to define metadata.
Okay.
So I have these 5 fields in a document, these 5 fields in a list. That's a base type of information. List definitions are base types of information. Those you should be using. And then from there, you should do things on lists. An action on an item. My workflows.
All right.
There's some 90 different points of interface in SharePoint where I can add something. Doesn't have to be anything spectacular, just a new menu action. Maybe I have something new in my administrative side. When I see a well-crafted SharePoint solution, and there aren't that many, but if you look at Nintex as an example, phenomenally well-implemented SharePoint solution. Their interface feels like you're in SharePoint.
Okay.
When I create a workflow, it feels like it's something that came with SharePoint. I have site actions, I have menu actions, I have custom administrative screens. I can do a layouts application, which is an ASP.NET app underneath SharePoint, but it runs in the context of SharePoint. So there's a number of places I can put code in SharePoint that is not a web part. Feature receivers, the ultimate magic of SharePoint. I activate a feature, and I can do anything I want. I have the option, it's just raw code at that point. Oftentimes you'll use this to prep a site. I have a site, I want to deploy new functionality to it. My feature receiver will have all the code that runs through and cleans up my site. It creates instances of objects that I need, sites, lists, content types, user provisioning. I can do all of that in my code simply by having one receiver. I can have a list receiver that does the exact same thing. I've not talked about web parts at all.
Right.
These are just things that happen when people use SharePoint. Those are the most successful SharePoint implementations.
Now, is that you're talking about? It feels like SharePoint. Everything feels like SharePoint, even the custom extensions that are built into it. Is that the advantages? What I'm hearing is that it's an advantage to the user. Is that because there's less of a learning curve? They only have to learn SharePoint. They don't have to learn some other paradigm.
Yep.
It's sort of built on top of that.
The training is kind of intuitive. Once they've learned SharePoint, they've learned what you're providing.
Okay.
It's already learned. It's for them. From an end user perspective, that's fine, but from the developer's perspective, it's easier to maintain. So what happens if you don't have experience in the architecture of SharePoint? You'll oftentimes do something that gets in the way of something that SharePoint's trying to do for you. You'll write a feature, wizard forms for document creation and metadata assignment. What you've in all essence done is replace the out-of-the-box SharePoint form. If you do that, then the fact that SharePoint can adapt for you. If I add a new field to my list, I'll have a new field on my interface.
But you lose that if
You
build
lose
your own
that.
custom.
You've now taken that away.
You've also lost some upgrade capabilities, right?
You do, because any changes to the underlying list form template you may not get. But it's not that you intentionally do it, it's that you just don't know.
Right.
You didn't see it there. You didn't know it was going to happen. Web parts don't really have that risk because they're just web parts. But that's really where I'd like to see the focus at, is working within SharePoint's framework. The other thing is, SharePoint has a great scale of features. There's just a phenomenal amount of things that it can do. There's a trick in knowing that it doesn't actually do everything. You'll end up oftentimes at clients who say, we want to make it do this. It's okay to say why. Why would you want to make it do that? It's a framework,
Right.
but every framework has its place. If you want inherent security, great. If you want high transactional systems, no. Absolutely not.
Okay, so at some point you need to question if you want too many things that aren't part of SharePoint. You need to question: are you really using SharePoint, or do you really need SharePoint in this case?
Right. Are you using SharePoint the right way?
Yeah.
What will happen in those instances? You'll end up. I call them down dark alleys. You end up in a dark alley in SharePoint, and you'll lose. You will always lose that fight. You'll get something out the door usually. It's not very scalable most times. Certainly not upgradable.
Not maintainable.
Not maintainable. We ran into issues from the previous version of SharePoint to this version of SharePoint. Custom site definitions. It's a best practice to use custom site definitions in SharePoint, except for the fact that you can't migrate them.
Migrate them to
the future versions of SharePoint. Once a custom site definition, always a custom site definition. Now this is a hot topic in the SharePoint development forums. Half the world believes you should use site definitions. It's the best practice. It's published. The other half of the world, which I happen to live on, says you should use feature stapling.
Okay.
I staple my features to SharePoint, my site. I don't have to care about upgrading. I'm just tacking code onto sites.
Oh, because it's more of there's a level of abstraction between
Yes,
SharePoint
absolutely.
and your features. Okay.
Which gets to something else, and this is kind of one of the basic things. I say SharePoint the right way. There's a couple of real core things you should be doing.
Yeah.
Never touch your own server. That's what solution packages are for.
Okay.
Everything should be deployed via a feature.
So don't be writing code directly on a server. Write code on a development machine and then deploy it to the server.
Via a solution package. They need to
Okay.
be portable. You need to go from dev to QA. This is no different from normal development. You need to do your unit testing. You need to do your QA testing, your user
Sure.
acceptance testing. It's difficult to move things when you don't have them in solution packages for SharePoint. Once you're in solution packages, your farm's easier to maintain. I don't have to make one web front end, 10 web front ends. I don't have to care.
Yeah.
Everything's handled by SharePoint at that point. That's a core tenet. You don't do that, your farm is non-maintainable.
Right.
That ends up being half of the engagements I work on. Things are put out there. You go up on Codeplex, and there's some stuff out there, and there's good stuff on Codeplex too. Patterns and practices, Codeplex SPG has a phenomenal application of how to do development in SharePoint. I believe
this is a white paper.
it is actual code samples.
Okay.
You can download the Visual Studio project from Microsoft's Patterns and Practices group. And they have really good stuff. I don't know that I agree with all of it, but it's certainly better than most of the stuff that's already out there.
Sure. I think one of the issues that people have with SharePoint, at least in my opinion, is it's relatively easy to install it and get a site up and running, create some lists, share some documents. That's a strength of SharePoint.
Yep.
But in a way, it's also a weakness because once you start, because you can sort of fall into it relatively easily without any training, now you're sort of in this environment and you may or may not know what best practices are.
Yeah, the non-development side, the infrastructure and setup, if you go ungoverned in SharePoint, it'll be a phenomenal success for approximately 18 months. At that point, it will be uncontrollable, and then you have to do a significant amount of work to be able to rein things in.
Yeah, that's a lot of rework as well.
What you don't want to do, and this is what, next, finish, I have SharePoint. You don't want to turn SharePoint into everybody has their own hard drive. That's really not the intent, and it's very easy to do that.
Okay.
Everybody just starts throwing things out there. It's uncategorized. There's no information architecture. That's critical. There's no content definition. Those are what you're really looking for, because the intent is to make everything that you're already doing more consumable by more folks. Search plays a critical role in that, but if you don't tag your data, tag your documents, search isn't really going to do anything other than find the same thing every other search engine does.
Sure, and this is planning you need to do up front.
Yes, absolutely.
Not 18 months later, when it's much harder. Right?
I've done both. It is much harder to do it 18 months
Okay.
later. Because you obviously have to undo things that have been done or
Right.
just write it off.
Mhm.
The other thing is understand what version of SharePoint you're developing for. The WSS development, very limited in what you can do.
Okay, the WSS is the free version or free
version
if
that
you want a
comes with
copy
server.
of Windows Server 2008.
MOS standard is publishing pages plus some workflows. So the publishing infrastructure that used to be MCMS. And then MOS Enterprises, which is where everything else lives.
Okay.
So if you're coding
Those
against
last two are not
WSS,
free.
correct. If you're writing against WSS, and that's your development platform, you have all the core elements. I still have my list, I still have my item receivers, I still have all of that. The interface you have. When you step up to MOS standard, now the question becomes, okay, I have a publishing infrastructure. How do I appropriately leverage the publishing infrastructure to accomplish my website design? Now, you'll see this for public internet sites most often,
Okay.
and intranet sites. Custom page layouts, custom master pages, custom themes. Those are all things that you'll write. What's a big difference oftentimes is when you talk pure ASP.NET web development versus SharePoint web development, SharePoint gives you 90% of what you need. You need to fill in the other 10%.
Okay.
So there's not, the amount of development is in smaller chunks. I
Okay.
need to supplement SharePoint here, I need to add a feature to SharePoint there, I need to change my master page here, but it's not a giant project.
And you need to recognize where those points are.
Yeah.
Let SharePoint do the things that it does well.
Now, MOS Enterprise is an entirely different beast. Once you jump up to MOS Enterprise, you have different features now. InfoPath form services. So now I have to decide whether InfoPath is a forms technology that I want to use for data capture. I have Performance Point now for business intelligence. I have Excel services. You have the BI capabilities. I think that about covers it.
Yeah.
But that feature set is different. Now I have InfoPath that I could use for workflow.
It's different, but isn't each version of SharePoint just a superset
Cumulative.
of the one before?
Yeah, it's cumulative.
Okay.
But you get different tools.
Yeah.
When you step up to MOS Enterprise, you get more features which will dictate what you would do and do not develop. As opposed to writing custom ASP.NET forms or a custom list with custom edit and new forms, I may use an InfoPath form, and you
Okay.
may never see the list.
Right.
I may use Excel services to take an Excel document and simply publish that out to everybody. That's good enough for my web content. I don't need a page at all.
They may not see your portal, your SharePoint portal at all. They'll just see the
Well, they'd see
Excel
the
spreadsheet.
they'd see the SharePoint portal, but inside the SharePoint portal would be Excel content.
Okay.
It just looks like a web page. So if that's just a new type of content that I can put inside SharePoint as a way of publishing.
Okay.
You could use Performance Point's business intelligence tools. That's my dashboard creator now. So as I get bigger, I have more options. And that really starts to become an issue in that people don't know their options. So they'll write what already exists.
Yeah.
They won't know that they could use the business data catalog to pull and query information in. They won't know all the points at which that will interact. They'll write some custom code and a solution that will handle that and be completely non-maintainable. It's not upgradable. You're outside the realm of SharePoint at this point.
Okay. So one of the best solutions to this problem is just educating developers. What's available in SharePoint? What's not? What do they need to themselves? Where's a good place for
And which
somebody?
ones don't work quite as advertised.
Okay. All right. So it's not enough to know what's in SharePoint. You need to know what's in SharePoint that really works.
Yes.
Where's a good place for somebody that's
Not that if
just getting
Microsoft's
started?
listening, anything doesn't work in SharePoint.
We love Microsoft.
We love Microsoft.
but they're not perfect. What is a good place for a developer to get started to learn some best practices? You mentioned
The patterns and practices, you can jump in reasonably well. The problem is the structure of SharePoint is probably more important than knowing how to code against it right away. If you go also, it's also up on Codeplex called SharePoint Manager 2007.
Okay.
It's a simple Windows app that brings down all of the different objects in the hierarchy that they exist inside SharePoint that you can manipulate. Every property and every setting that's available is there.
Okay.
Best way, bar none, to find out everything that's in SharePoint. Don't ever do this on a production server because it's read-write. If you go and change something, you will break your farm. Just keep that in mind.
Right.
But you'll know everything that's in there. So it's very easy to understand that I need to provision a web application or a site collection or a subweb or a list or a document or different content types or the schema file.
Sure.
If you can see them visually and how they break down in SharePoint.
I agree. That's one of the things that I've struggled with doing SharePoint development is what's the scope of the change that I'm making? And there is a hierarchy to it, and at least to me, the names of the levels in the hierarchy aren't intuitive.
Well, it also doesn't help with the fact that the documented names and the actual underlying technical names are not the same.
That's why they're not intuitive.
Yes. Site collections are an SP site, and sites are an SP web.
Right.
So once you get that down, you're a little better. But understanding the security model that works within SharePoint,
Okay.
that's something that's not really an ASP.NET concept.
Mm.
In SharePoint, each of your levels is a securable object.
Okay.
My document is securable. I have different audiences and permissions that I can set on the document or the list or the site or the web application.
Mm.
I can use Active Directory or forms-based authentication or LDAP or Windows Live ID or OpenID.
Mm.
So they've got these places that you just plug these things in, where before, maybe I had to write my own provider to do forms-based authentication. But
Okay.
that's pre-ASP.NET 2.0, but maybe I had to write my own provider for Windows Live. There's a lot of that stuff up on Codeplex. You can find a good chunk of it. And then there's a lot of site templates. You'll spend a lot of time doing site templates in SharePoint development.
Okay.
Ways of packaging up things that you've done otherwise.
All right. And you're blogging about SharePoint, right?
I am. thesharepoint.spaces.live.com or thesharepoint.live.spaces.com. I can't remember which one.
All right, we'll look it up. We'll put a link to it.
Okay.
All right. Anything else?
No, I think that's good.
All right. Jesse, thanks a lot. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
No problem.
Great job.